another Tudor travel guide here, and welcome back to this month's episode of the Tudor Travel Guide's A to Z of Tudor Places. Now in this episode we are going to be exploring one of the finest examples of late medieval architecture in England, and that is Gainsborough Old Hall in Lincolnshire, a real gem if ever there was one. Now, the house was constructed by Thomas Burr, who was an aspiring courtier of the mid to late 15th century. And according to the esteemed architectural historian Anthony Emery, Gainsborough Old Hall stands alone as the most complete courtier house of the period in England. And it really is a splendid monument to one man's ambitions and accomplishments across one of the most turbulent periods of English history. So let's start with a little bit of background, as we usually do. So in 1455, Thomas inherited Gainsborough Old Hall. Now at the time he was a young man of just 25 years old. He was ambitious, he was capable, and he certainly had no intention of leading the quiet country life. Thomas set about demonstrating his allegiance to the Lancastrian King Henry VI and was rewarded in turn with grants of land. And yet, little like Sir William Paulet nearly a century later, Thomas Burr was able to reincarnate himself of the reins of power shifted from Lancastrian to Yorkist kings and then, well, back again. Now, his grandson, another Thomas, also Sir Thomas Burr therefore, would continue the family's position at the heart of royal power. He was knighted on Flodden Field after the victory over the Scots, becoming a trusted courtier at the court of Henry VIII and serving as a senior member of Anne Boleyn's household as her Lord Chamberlain. Now back to Gainsborough Old Hall itself. Well, dendrochronology has dated the development of the house over a period of about 20 years, from the early 1460s to the late 1470s. During that period, successive ranges of the house were built, and those commenced with the East Range, which contained the family's privy chambers. The current Great Hall followed, which probably replaced an earlier structure, and finally the guest lodgings in the West Range. Now, we'll come back to the arrangement of the rooms again shortly. In the meantime, though, a little more of the hall's brushes with royalty. So King Richard III was entertained at Gainsborough Hall by the first Thomas Burr when he stayed there overnight in October 1483. But perhaps today it is best known for its association with not one, but two of Henry VIII's wives. Now the first of these, the one most associated with Gainsborough, is Catherine Parr. And in the late spring of 1529, she journeyed north to begin her life as the wife of Edward Burr, son of Sir Thomas Burr and his wife Agnes Tyrwhitt. Catherine was just a young bride of around 17 years old. Now at the time, Lincolnshire was one of the most isolated of the English shires, mainly attributed to geographical factors and inadequate transport network. The Great North Road, which entered the county at Stamford, was the only easy overland approach from the south, from London. And as a consequence, most southerners viewed the county as unwholesome and uncivilised. Opinions, of course, largely based on ignorance. But it is true to say that Henry VIII famously described its inhabitants as, quote, one of the most brute and beastly of the whole realm. This remote county was still governed from London, but it was a world away from the lavish ceremonies and endless intrigues of the Tudor court. But nevertheless, it was now Catherine's home. Unfortunately for Catherine, her time at Gainsborough Hall cannot have been easy. By all accounts, Catherine's father-in-law was an overbearing and cantankerous man who, according to Catherine's biographer, Susan James, quote, ruled his family with an iron hand, unquote. And while there can be little doubt that Sir Thomas expected those under his roof to obey him, Linda Porter suggests that he was probably more flexible when it came to spiritual matters, and, quote, that he indeed himself was interested in new religious ideas and kept a reforming chaplain in his household, unquote. Now, the passion and interest in the new religion must have had some effect on Catherine's own views, and she may well have engaged in religious discussions with the Burgh's chaplain. Interestingly though, according to Anthony Emery, there has been no direct physical evidence of a chapel or an oratory ever found at Gainsborough, although there clearly was one, as Thomas's will lists vestments which were associated with this office. Catherine left Gainsborough Hall in 1531. She moved out of that family home with her young husband to become mistress of her own house in nearby Curton in Lindsay, which is 12 miles or so from the main Burgh family home, and no doubt she was most relieved to do so, although her husband would not live long. But now let's look at our next Tudor queen, who is of course Catherine Howard. She is also associated with Gainsborough, as she stayed at the Old Hall for 3 days alongside her husband Henry VIII during the return leg of the court's progress to York in August 1541. Now, retrospectively, this turned out to be an extremely eventful progress, with Catherine being arrested on charges of adultery soon after the royal couple arrived back in London. And it was time spent in country houses like Gainsborough that would be amongst the teenaged Catherine's last taste of freedom. But what about the layout of the hall itself? Where did the likes of Catherine Parr and Catherine Howard lodge when they were at Gainsborough? Well, the core of the medieval lodgings remains incredibly much as they were in the 16th century, although some of the outer elements of the manor house appear to have been lost to time. The building itself was built partly of brick and partly timber framed, as you will see today, and it consists now, as it did in the 16th century, of 3 ranges that were arranged in the form of a letter C, built around a courtyard. Now, there's also evidence of a moat which existed on the northwest and east of the property, and Emery postulates that originally the house may have been accessed from the north across the moat via a gatehouse which led into a north-facing courtyard. All that, unfortunately, has since been lost. The main entrance to the house would have been via a doorway which led into the lower end of the hall, which still very much exists today, and then into a screens passage which unfortunately has been lost to time. So off the Great Hall at the lower end were the usual 3 doorways which still exist today, fantastic survivors of the medieval period, a central corridor leading to the kitchen, and on either side the pantry and buttery. And those kitchens survive in a remarkable state of repair. Also accessible from this low end of the hall is the West Range, which originally contained 3 floors of lodgings, and many of which featured their own fireplace and garderobe or toilet, while from the high end of the hall, the family could access their private apartments in the East Range. Now, during the Tudor period, this latter East Range housed the large ceremonial chambers of the house and a three-storied polygonal tower, which also formed part of the family's private apartments. And an inventory made in 1496, after the death of Thomas Burr, lists his house as having a hall, a parlour, an inner parlour, a withdrawing room, a great chamber with another next to it, a chamber in the tower, and in the gallery, all rooms you would expect to find in an aristocratic house of the day. And if you visit today, the main entrance of the house, though, will take you into this east wing of Gainsborough Old Hall, with the ground floor serving as a restaurant and shop. But being in the east wing, as described, you're actually now in the family's private apartments. Thus, you would have been surrounded by some of the most sumptuous chambers in the house. The arrangements for the lodgings of Henry VIII and Catherine Howard during that 1541 progress are sadly not known. However, it has been postulated that on account of the king's size and infirmity by that date, 1541, it's most likely that he was lodged on the ground floor, in the area now occupied by the shop. It's also thought that this would make it likely that Catherine's rooms were located on the first floor, just a few turns away up the Vice stair, which is still part of the old hall's tower. While some extraneous buildings associated with the hall have in fact indeed been lost, and its grounds and gardens have been greatly diminished over time, Gainsborough Old Hall is still a staggering survivor of time and associated with some of the principal figures in Tudor history. So it is well worth a visit, even though at times it can be a little tricky to reach. And on that point, my friends, let me say a little bit more. Because if you're planning a trip to Gainsborough Old Hall, I do recommend basing yourself in the nearby city of Lincoln. And here you will find the best of the accommodation and amenities in the area. The old part of the city is glorious, with its castle, its cathedral, and the ruins of the Bishop's Palace, where Henry VIII and Catherine Howard also stayed during the same 1541 progress. And while you are there, a visit to Gainsborough Old Hall can be easily done in half a day. But be warned, this glorious medieval house, once surrounded by pretty gardens, a moat and swathes of open countryside, is now engulfed by scruffy modernity, terraced houses, supermarkets, and even a McDonald's might well be passed as you make your way there. And if you're like me, you may well begin to think that your sat-nav has made some terrible mistake. How could such a thing of such great beauty be located in such a epitome of suburbia? Then, whether you're arriving on foot or by car, you will turn into one of the most unassuming of urban streets, and the hall will be directly in front of you and completely take your breath away. I defy you not to say wow several times over as you alight from your car or as you approach, and I just begin to appreciate what a miracle it is that this ancient house has survived virtually intact since its last Tudor owners vacated the premises. So now a word or two about how you can get to Gainsborough Old Hall. As I did say, it is in rather an isolated spot. Well, you can drive there, of course, and there is parking around the hall, but within a normal residential area. So the availability will be depending on the time of day and the day that you arrive. You can also get the bus into the central station in Gainsborough, and the hall is about a 5-minute walk away, or you can take the train and you can get to the Lee Road railway station, which is about 20 minutes walk away from the hall through most of the week. Or if you're coming on a Saturday, you can come to Gainsborough Central Station. So there are in fact lots of different ways of getting there, and although it is a little bit out on a limb, it's actually also in a strange way rather accessible, which is great news. So now to finish, to my Tudor Rose rating for Gainsborough Old Hall. Well, firstly, its historical significance. Well, at least 4, if not 4.5 Tudor roses. It is, after all, associated with 2 Tudor queens. So as for the authenticity, well, that has to be 5 Tudor roses. It's another one of those places that's raw and real, and you really do have this sense that the Tudor owners have kind of just left 10 minutes ago. It has such a unique feel about it. So as for the wow factor, well, I'm going to give it 5 Tudor roses. First of all, it's a miracle. It's still there in such a raw state, and I just love that. And also the fact that the atmosphere is just very, very special, and you're unlikely to bump into hordes of other tourists visiting. So you can really have time to drink it all in. In terms of accessibility, well, at least 4 Tudor roses. A lot of the hall is on the ground floor, although as far as I'm aware, there's no access to the upper parts of the hall, so you would not be able to visit the first floor or into the stair turret tower. So that might make accessibility a little bit limited, and also, of course, from the point of view, it is a bit out on the limb from the usual tourist trail, although, as I mentioned, you can actually reach it by car, by train, or by bus. So all in all, yeah, I give it 4 Tudor roses for accessibility. Now, in terms of arriving by car, you might want to note that the hall is surrounded on all sides by houses. It's a very residential area, so parking is limited. Although when I arrived, I did so on a Sunday, so had no problem just pulling up outside. But you may find that during busier times you need to park in the town, as in either the marketplace or Marshall's Yard car parks, and then just take a 5 to 10 minute stroll through the town to reach the hall. So with that, we are concluding this month's A to Z of Tudor Places, and I hope you enjoyed my potted history of Gainsborough Old Hall, and that you will have chance to visit in the near future. So until next month, happy time travelling!